Hey, good day, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, and you're listening to another DevOps.com webinar. Thanks for coming. Today's webinar is sponsored by our friends at IBM and the IBM Cloud. Today's webinar is Beyond Build Pipelines, Continuous Deliveries, Messy Reality. It's going to be a great webinar, but before we get started with our panelists, I wanted to just take a quick moment. As usual, we have set aside time for questions from our audience, and we're looking forward to a very interactive session with lots of questions. If you can go to your control panel settings, you will see the area marked questions, and we ask that you put your questions in there. And you can type them in real time. They'll be queued. We'll have a record of them. You do not have to worry about remembering your questions, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. If you have technical problems, maybe the slides aren't advancing, the audio is not working, some other issue, we do have folks standing by in our chat room who will try to help you with any technical issues. So if you have a technical problem, please use the chat window if you can, and we can take care of that there. With that being said, we are getting a little background noise. Whoever muted, it just went off, so that's all good. And with that said, let's get started. As I mentioned, today's webinar is Beyond Build Pipelines, Continuous Deliveries, Messy Reality. Let me introduce you to what I think are two great panel members who are going to be discussing this today. If we could go to our next slide. So we have Al Wagner, who's a technical evangelist at IBM and who I've worked with before. Al, welcome to DevOps.com webinars.
Thanks very much, Al.
Pleasure to have you here, my friend. And joining Al today is Chris Nowak. Chris has also actually been on webinars with us in the past, and he is the Chief Transformation Officer for Kingsman Software. You can read their complete bios here online, but Chris, if you wouldn't mind, take a moment. Who is Kingsman Software? Just a quick background for those who may not be familiar, a little bit of your background, and then Al, if you can take it from Chris from there.
Certainly.
All right. Thanks, Alan. Hi, I'm Chris Nowak, and I represent Kingsman Software. We're a consultancy based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. A lot of us actually came from Bank of America, Wells Fargo, or both, where we worked for 20 years. So we have a sort of a focus on fintech, but what we do is a bit agnostic. So we have a gamut of things we offer: software development as a service, DevOps advisory and implementation, UX analytics, and lean agile practices.
And myself, Alan introduced me as Al Wagner. I've been in IT for an awful long time, over 23 years now, in a variety of different roles that span the DevOps delivery pipeline. And more recently, I've been out traveling the world, talking to lots of customers from hundreds of organizations to help them advance their DevOps transformation. So let's get into things. Let's start with saying software is winning. More and more companies are embracing new technologies, are becoming faster at getting innovation out into the hands of the customer, and they're disrupting their markets. If I look at something like Facebook, they don't really create any content, or Airbnb disrupting the hotel industry, but they don't own any real estate. And then one of my favorites is the Domino's story. They did a couple of things. They worked at making their product better, and then they really focused on satisfying their customer. They really did a good job with the e-commerce, your ability to order a pizza through Twitter or Alexa. You're able to track your order. It's really customer service that's really helped them to gain financially in the world. And, they've outperformed Google from 2004 to 2016. Couple of others, Lyft and Uber have dramatically disrupted the taxi cab industry, where they're devaluing the cost of taxi cab licenses, and people have made investments in this. So, software is winning, it's making a difference, and those that are getting on board are really advancing their business and growing revenue, gaining market share, as well as satisfying their customers. Chris, and I know you've got lots of experience in the financial sector. What's some of the changes going on there that you see?
But I want to circle back to the pizza just for a minute, because it kind of snuck up on me at least, and everything I agree with everything you're saying, Al. Where all of a sudden one day I'm looking online. I think it might have been Papa John's, and I could just do everything I wanted with the pizza right there in the mobile app. And it was one of those things where you weren't thinking of it, and it just crept up on you, and it was there. So the software is winning. I was reading a book this weekend. It was given to me by a friend of mine, and it's by New Relic, called The New Kingmakers. And they said, I guess PricewaterhouseCoopers puts out a top 100 global list of software companies, but like the top 20 are no older than 1989. And the point of the paragraph I was reading is that, so this is right from the book, some of the biggest software firms aren't considered software firms. And I think about Google, right? Because they're making money with the software, not from it. And so software isn't their commercial asset anymore, but the enabler to the alternative business models. And I think what you're looking at right there exemplifies that. We're starting to see the same thing in the financial industry, to answer your question, where you have the fintechs coming in. There's a lot of disruption going on. Obviously, the banks and the fintechs, they aren't creating software necessarily, although there's a lot of in-house software development, but they're using it to enable new business models. And so I think the parallels, no matter what industry you're in, you're seeing the usage of software to either dominate or disrupt the industries they're already in.
Yeah, and again, the key message here is they are getting innovation out into the hands of their customers faster to deliver business results. But on the other side of the coin, tech has its bad days as well. The Knight Capital story on how to lose $440 million in 30 minutes. If you're not familiar with that story, what had happened was they were deploying out to their production environment, and they missed one of the servers. So we had a number of servers that were running new code and one server running old code, and it started to trade against itself. And then they tried to remediate the problem by rolling back, which just made the problem even bigger because they got that wrong. Very manual approach to releasing the software. And through this rogue trading, that compiled into $440 million in that 30 minutes. And then the SEC slapped another $13 million fine on them for a $453 million cost. And they eventually went out of business. They got sold for pennies on the dollar. If we look at ObamaHealthcare.gov, perhaps didn't go as smoothly as people would have hoped. Perhaps if they had, managed the release a little better and performance tested things together, that we wouldn't have had these outages or this inability for people to connect to the website and sign up. So while there's some great stories, we want to avoid those bad press days, because that's not going to do anything to help our stakeholders with brand recognition or delighting the end user. Chris, you heard any horror stories in your travels?
Well, I think commenting on this, right? It's as we're able to, new software is created or new technologies, and as we're able to deliver things faster, it kind of increases the need, right? The customers demand more. We want everything on our mobile now. So with the speed and the bigger experiences, it's sort of creating sort of a perfect storm where if you don't navigate it right, you get exactly what you're showing on the screens. And it kind of reminds me of some of the basics, though, for those that are familiar with The Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt. He talks about the theory of constraints, where if you're optimizing for local variables, but you're not thinking about the big picture of the holistic variables or optimizations. And that's kind of what happens here, right? When you're not thinking about the big picture, how things are interacting, seemingly small problems get very big very fast. And I don't think that's tied to any particular industry. I think we just see that in general. That's, as we start to talk about the pipelines, we're looking at how do you solve those types of problems, and we'll get to that.
Right. So, the name of the game here is we need to get that innovation quickly out to our market so that we can learn faster. Within the guiding principles of DevOps, it's about optimizing the system of the whole to close the feedback loop and learn if the idea and the requirements match what the customer is expecting. But along the way, we have insight into is the code actually delivering against the requirements? Is the code testable? Does the requirements align with the idea that we wanted from the start? It's all about learning, and the faster we can learn, the faster we can make corrections, the faster we can resolve issues or avoid issues escaping into production and, again, putting risk against the business and missing to meet what the customer's expectations are.
Yeah, Al, I think you touched on it exactly right. We want to learn safely, and we want to be able to fail safely. And those aren't bad things, but what it does is it increases the feedback loop. And if I had to make a list, I would say, that loop is basically creating visibility, finding the attributions, learning from it, and then fast adapting. The pipelines here, this process you have here, and what we'll talk about is really automation is just capturing, what your desired process is and the behaviors you want to get the process. So it's all about tightening the loop and creating the visibility.
So really, how do we do this? How do we accomplish this continuous delivery? Well, it's a build pipeline. And, it typically starts with the developer making a code change, a commit to a version control system, kicks off a build automation process of some type, and maybe runs some unit tests. And initially, if we satisfied that criteria, we felt pretty good about ourselves. But now we're starting to see some complexities around, we're going beyond the unit test. We're going to move it into, say, an integration test environment where we're going to leverage virtual services and automated tests to test the messages exchanged between components or microservices. And then we're going to bring them all together, and we're going to do a user acceptance test or a system integration test to make sure that all the pieces go. And then we put them into production. Through automation, that helps us with advancing the delivery or accelerating the delivery, and we learn along the way. But Chris, I know you're very strong believer in tools will only get you so far.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things to remember here is, first of all, we need tools, right? But when we start with tools, you can get it very easily into a condition where you automate bad process. And when you do that, it just makes bad things happen faster. So you have to smartly use the tools. And usually you do that by taking a look at your process first. Are you doing things in your process that you really shouldn't be doing at all, or maybe that needs to change? Because things evolve, processes evolve just like tools do all the time. And when you start to try to do that at scale, if you get into microservices and everything else, you're increasing the potential for a much larger footprint of impact. So, start smartly. The build pipeline is the building block for it all. But, I would say the piece of advice there is make sure you're automating what you want to automate.
And to help, there are tools available that makes the pipelines look easy. Even on the IBM cloud, we have delivery pipelines that allow you to have the stages of build, validate, and deploy. And there's a link if you wanted to investigate the IBM capabilities. On the bottom right-hand side, we've got a Jenkins delivery pipeline. It allows us to visualize and have insight as to how things are progressing, where things are, what's the status of things as they move across. So it's a learning tool. We can automate it, but we also get access to data where we can feed from that or make changes as necessary. And honestly, this isn't new. Urbancode from IBM has been around for a while. It was acquired about 5 years ago. But prior to Urbancode was Ansible Pro. Same type of capability where we had the various stages, the various capability areas within the delivery pipeline. The interface was slightly different, top down as opposed to left to right, but it was still a build, it was still a deploy, it was still an approval, it was still a release to production.
Yeah, so Al, that picture is bringing back some memories. You're right, it's a vertical pipeline, but we were using Ansible Pro actually back in 2006, and right before DevOps was even a word. But it allowed us to do some really amazing things. We were able to capture the process, and at one place we worked at, we had over 350 applications represented in Ansible Pro from source to prod. And the impact it had on the business unit we worked for, it's just hard to describe. It was just stunning.
So, Chris, I'm asking you, are we done? Is that sufficient, really, with the direction that technology is going and the teams are going and the technologies that they're embracing as they move to new architectures and move to getting code into production faster.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I've heard a couple comments here and there over the years. Yeah, we did DevOps last year, or yeah, we're done with it. And I think, that can get you into trouble because DevOps doesn't really end, or the automation pieces don't really end. Technology is always evolving. Consumer and customer needs are always evolving. So you always have to keep pace with that. And yeah, I think you have to keep that in mind. Like your processes also, and the tools that support the process, that's always going to continue to evolve as you go. Today, we're worrying about microservices and other things. At the higher level of principle, it's sort of all the same thing. Maybe we're handling a little bit more scale, but the principle still applies. So we're never done, I think, is the point.
Great point, Chris, and I completely agree with you. For me, DevOps has always been a journey. It's not a sprint; it's a marathon. It takes some time. So let's look at a scenario on where we're going on the messy reality of releasing software. I'm sure many of us have had experience with airlines where there's upcharges for value add components. Perhaps you want to check some luggage. Perhaps you want to pre-buy a meal. Perhaps you want to reserve your seat. These are all revenue generating capabilities that the airlines are offering. But let's look at one where perhaps the airline now wants to charge you for that napkin that they put under your drink cup. And you've paid for the drink too. But if we look at the systems that make up this airline application and the various user interfaces, to sell a napkin, we have to update the POS system on the plane where the flight attendant can actually enter it and take your credit card information. You could reserve it in advance on a .com site. Perhaps you do it at the airport at a kiosk. Maybe you call out to the customer service team. Maybe you're on a mileage program, and if you fly so much, you get napkins for free. There's a whole bunch of systems that are behind these various interfaces that are going to need to be changed in order to implement that charge for napkin. Maybe it's microservices where we can feed our teams with 2 pizzas. Maybe it's updates to a mainframe system. Maybe it's updates to an ERP system. We need to coordinate all of these moving pieces so that they get to production together and work. It would be awfully embarrassing if they wanted to charge for a napkin, and you could do it at the kiosk, but perhaps the point of sale system wasn't ready yet, or the mileage program wasn't connected, where there was no charge for that napkin. So, really what we're talking about here is we need to test the system together, we need to deploy the system together, we need to release the system together, and it may be a combination of microservices and database updates and mainframe updates and ERP system updates and J2EE, the traditional 3-tier type of application updates. There's a lot of moving pieces here. So that's the reality of what we're seeing today.
Yeah, this slide, Al, I got a love-hate with it, I think, just because I don't want the airlines to get the idea that they should start charging for napkins. And I know you're not suggesting that. But I think, the point's well taken, right? We're getting in this situation. And so it's not just within a specific company. When you start to integrate with outside systems, aside from the fact that you're scaling your applications at kind of like fleet-wise, by using containers, microservices, when you start to integrate with all of the other vendors around you to deliver sort of a much more broad system or service, it gets very, very complicated at that point. So, to your point, build, test, and deploy together becomes much more complicated exponentially than what we had to deal with 7 or 8 years ago.
So really what you're talking about, Chris, is something like this, where we've got a number of different delivery pipelines that at some point, maybe the top 3 are microservices, maybe the 4th one is a mainframe update. Maybe the 5th one is we just need to have coordination or orchestration with that third-party vendor that's going to be updating something to support our ability to charge for these napkins. The message holds true. It's still we need to test together, deploy what we've tested together, and then release that system as a whole. And that unto itself, maybe this is a few squads or a tribe within my organization, the coordination there is quite complex. But then when we get to this model, the systems of the systems, where we're looking across the enterprise, and we need to make sure all of these moving pieces, and there could be hundreds of moving pieces, all need to get to production at the same time, so we don't have a bad press day. You know, and you know, my colleague Eric Minnick, he sees so many organizations that are using this very modern release management tool that, you know, many refer to as Microsoft Excel, as their mechanism to coordinate all of these moving pieces. You know, spreadsheets that are 12 tabs wide and 50,000 lines of, okay, I'm going to do this now, and I'm going to do this now, and I'm going to do this now. That's prone to error. It's not reliable, and you know, repeatability. It takes a long time to go through those various steps. So, you know, this is the true messy reality in this microservices, containerized world that we're moving towards. We are starting to see more and more pieces. We're not talking about deploying a monolithic application anymore. We're talking about, you know, again, hundreds of components that need to go into production at the same time, because at the end of the day, what matters to the customer is it works, and what matters to the business is their brand reputation has been protected. We need to reduce the risk to the business.
Yeah, I think, you know, the interesting thing about this, well, there's a lot of interesting things about this picture, but it says systems of systems, but it's probably more than that. It's systems of systems of systems, right? And they're all in different states, different technologies, different teams. And so years ago, I think, you know, when we moved, if you think about the constraints in the delivery process, it was focusing on the build. How do we get the build automated, consistent, templates, the whole thing, and we, you know, found CI. It then probably moved somewhere, probably to deploys became a constraint, and then testing became a constraint. Today, it starts to feel a little bit more like the environments might be the constraint, but more than that, and particularly on this picture, it's orchestrating the deployment of multiple facets of whatever that large system is. And that gets very complex. Although when you think about it, though, this is a pipelines that are componentized as well. So again, you can kind of go back to basics and say, make sure my components of the pipeline are correct, and then you can stack it up from there.
So, you know, I guess the one rule that we want everybody to leave with, Chris, is, you know, as we're orchestrating these complex releases, if you test it together, ship it together. If you need to back out a piece because it's perhaps not working quite as you expected, or you need to back out multiple pieces because of coupling, because the functionality isn't ready yet, test the new bundle together and then ship it together. If we can remember that one rule, that will go a long way in helping to, you know, again, reduce risk of the business. So, you know, one of the techniques that people are using are feature flags. You know, hopefully everybody's aware of what feature flags are, but if not, it's really the ability to wrap new technology or new code within some logic so that you can always have deployable code in your trunk, meaning that I should be able to press the button and deploy into production at any time. My code has been tested, it's known to work well. And as the pieces, all these moving pieces start to introduce this new functionality, when they go into production together, we're able to toggle the feature flag to on and let our consumers, you know, work in this new code, this new feature capability. In my travels and talking to people who have gone down this path, you know, it adds some technical debt, and there's actually a lot of complexity behind it. There's a maturity level required for implementation of feature flags, because again, you have to coordinate that feature flag across all of the different moving pieces.
So it's interesting because you're starting to touch on the fact that this becomes less of a technical, well, it is a technical challenge, but it's also a behavioral or a cultural or collaboration challenge. And I think we'll talk about that in a bit. I've seen some teams using feature flags, not a lot. And I think it's still because they're trying to nail down some of the other parts, making sure the pipelines are solid and those sorts of things. There are many teams out there that are doing it, But I think, like you said, the other point is it sort of has to be a broad-based approach. It's basically decoupling the release from the deployment. And when you create the feature flags, the other thing to think about is you're basically creating another item to manage. So you might want to think about the feature flag as a component, because now you have to manage all of these sets of them and figure out which ones get turned on and off as you go. So no, it's not trivial, but if you put the right thought in ahead of time, it can make the downstream work easier.
Absolutely. But there is a maturity level with respect to the feature flags.
Absolutely.
So, and then, you know, if we look at cloud native and this move to microservices and containers, there's stuff out there to help with configuring and manage the complexity of some of these releases. You know, Bosch on Cloud Foundry, or Helm charts in Kubernetes, or Docker Compose in Docker Swarm. That's great if we're moving to, you know, this 12-factor world of we've encapsulated everything. We've taken that monolithic application and perhaps peeled off a piece of it to create this microservice that we're going to deploy into a container. But more often than not, you know, this takes a long time. This is a journey. If you're working from some legacy IT investment and you need to update it, it's re-architecting our applications, and it's not something that happens overnight. You know, starting down that road is a good start, but understand that the journey could be long. So, you know, even in some of the more sophisticated enterprises that we've talked to that are moving towards this 12-factor and microservice architectures, you know, when we really start to peel back the covers and we see how their applications are structured, you know, we ask them, are your containers or your microservices truly decoupled? They're fully encapsulated and isolated from each other. Because if they are, then yes, I could put that into production with lower risk. But the reality is we're traditionally not seeing a lot of that. You know, the containers in the cloud, whether it be public or private, are coupled. We have dependencies on legacy IT that perhaps hasn't been containerized yet or turned into a microservice. And then we've got database updates. You know, those in themselves can be challenging. And there's vendors out there that do a really good job of helping to deliver database schema changes. You know, a couple come to mind, DataCal and DB Maestro are a couple that can help you as you move to this world. But honestly, I don't see a lot of enterprises where they are truly 12-factor within how they're re-architecting their applications. Chris, what's your thoughts here?
I think the big takeaway on this is you're going to be in a hybrid. Most companies are going to be in a hybrid mode for a very long time. You have to blend the older legacy with the newer. I know Gartner likes to say the word two-speed IT, but I think it's much more variable than that. But at the end of the day, you might have some new greenfield stuff, and you're always going to have this back end. And if you have mainframe in your organization, you're going to be there for a while. So, you know, how do you handle that, right? You do want to modernize, and I think it's kind of going back to some of the basics and the principles where, you know, whether you have a fleet of containers or a fleet of pipelines or even just a scrum of scrums, groups of teams, right? You have to start small. So start in a place where you get it right, kind of a reference model, and then templatize that somehow, whether that's a process or a group or behaviors or your applications, and then scale it from there. And always look to build on that. There's always going to be exceptions, so you have to be able to handle those exceptions. So first of all, have a plan to start small and templatize. Get everything in source control. I like that DB's on this picture because everybody forgets about it. You know, typically I hear, well, just email those SQL scripts, right? And that's a no-go. If it's moving, manage it. And maybe you have to do it incrementally because it's a big piece of something to grab, but start grabbing it if it's moving and managing it. There's always going to be complexities and dependencies, right? Like we said, this is always a journey. It really won't end. So it's just constantly trying to.
So, you know, we've talked about some of these complexities and the realities of a messy release pipeline, but really I want to give you some hope. I want to give you 3 paths that can help solve this challenge. Earn the build pipelines. This is going to take some work. Truly decouple the microservice, the monolithic application into microservices, encapsulated microservices that handle a piece of functionality. You can eliminate some of these external dependencies, leveraging APIs and managing those APIs. And you can look at the feature flag option to manage these big changes, and we can, move stuff into our test stages through to production and turn on those features by flipping a switch or through routing, and then checking to make sure that things are working properly. And by checking, I mean have a pipeline with monitoring on those two. One of the things we're seeing is, putting the ops in the DevOps piece, the shift left up the operations team, bringing them over into your test environments and having the event monitoring and incident management and runbook automations in place that can help mature your pipeline and, again, reduce the risk to the business. If we look at, the release automation tools, a lot of them today, we have solutions where we can do build automation, through a commit, some sort of a version control system. Then there's some unit tests. Maybe we push it into an integration test, and we've got multiple pipelines that are feeding that model. But then we get to a point where we finally have to bring all the pieces together. So in the integration test world, I got to test the dependency on another team in this multi-speed IT world that Chris referred to. I can leverage virtual services or stubs or mocks, whatever you want to call them, to simulate these other features from the other pieces as I get quality feedback on my particular change. But we're going to reduce our reliance on these stubs and mocks as we move through to production, and we're going to want to test everything together. So this may be the more traditional model that we see today, where multiple delivery pipelines, these multiple build pipelines, feed into a release automation solution that will allow me to take version 1 of application A and version 7 of application B and version 15 of application C and make sure they move together as a cohesive unit across each one of my test stages en route to production. I'm wondering, did we lose Chris?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
I was just enthralled with what you were speaking
We had
about.
talked a lot about this, Chris, and this is something, that you have told me that you see more often in the organizations you're working with.
Yeah, I think this is a common model pretty much where most of the companies I've seen or been with, where, every one of those pipelines on the left, it might be coming from different groups or, even different divisions. But this kind of goes back to what we were saying, right? You want to be able to take one of those streams and just take the top one and say, you know what, we're going to work on this one, and we're going to optimize the process, we're going to lean it out, and we're going to put the right tools in place and learn your lessons there, and then you can move it on to the others. You might be able to do a few of those in parallel, you might not, but at the end of the day, there's always a hybrid. Now, one other interesting thing is it doesn't necessarily have to be an automated flow. There might be some manual processes, and you might model that as well and say, well, the DBAs are going to do something along this line, and this is their process. But the goal is to make everything visible and then to get it all into a place. In this case, it's coalescing into the test environment where it can be tested together and really vetted out. So it isn't just about modeling automated processes. And by the way, it doesn't need to be agile. It can be waterfall. It can be anything. And it could be manual as well. But you need to look at the big picture. And it kind of goes back to, don't focus on these local process optimizations, because what's good for the local often isn't really good for the bigger picture across all of the different systems. Keeping track of the interrelated items in a release, this is one of those things. This model helps you do that. And, all the pieces of deployment are hard. This, in some ways, helps you automate that challenge so you can at least get some visibility and some push button. As you move this model, though, and you kind of go towards the microservices approach, that does create challenges. What it does is it takes away some things, but it creates other challenges, because now you start to really, really scale up, which you saw in some earlier diagrams. That's a different problem to manage, which with many more moving parts. So,
right. So in the first option where we talked about, these microservice architectures where we're leveraging feature flags and APIs to manage or to perhaps mask or manage the complexity, we have somewhat of a simple delivery pipeline. But for many of the folks that we're dealing with that are moving from these legacy enterprise applications to a more modern architecture, these deployments can be quite difficult. And there can be some highly coupled components within those delivery pipeline. And again, this bringing it into a release management solution or a release automation solution allows us to ensure that we take all those dependencies together as that unit through to production. And we're testing it, living up to our one rule of if you test it together, ship it together. So now we're seeing this third one starting to emerge. Release management, or you may be hearing it called value stream mapping. And what we're seeing here is as we move to these microservice architectures, and there's a variety of different deployment automation solutions out there, the deployments are getting, maybe they're coming back to be a little easier. The microservices architecture where I create, I commit, I build, I test, I deploy, and maybe I've masked some of the new functionality with a feature flag. But this value stream management capability allows me to use multiple delivery pipelines, go through some preliminary testing, and then in my staging environment, that last QA check, that point where I can turn on the feature flag, run some user tests from a usability, from a performance, from a reliability, from a supportability, from a functionality, from a security point of view, and then as one cohesive unit, manage the release across multiple delivery pipelines. So it's a little different than the previous one, because in this model we're looking at applications that are loosely coupled, and we still have some dependencies, but we can build them in isolation up to a point where this allows us to move much faster. We've got that one last QA gate, and when we get blessing that the feedback has been that the quality is at a sufficient level, then we're ready to release. And that's really key. What we're seeing is managing multiple delivery pipelines so that when we're ready to go to production, we've validated that the features are working together, and then we take that one unit and move it over to the production world. But Chris, I know when we were discussing this could seem a little overwhelming. So what's your advice here?
Yeah. So first of all, this is kind of at least for the technologies we know today, this can be considered, I don't want to say an end state, but sort of a target where you want to move towards things being highly componentized, very standardized, that sort of thing. So, but it can be overwhelming because there's only one of these here on this page, but we've seen a page before where there's 4 of these things on it. So it's like everything else, right? You eat the elephant one bite at a time. So pick a stream and start nibbling it away. So if you can have an independent control over one area, just start to optimize that. And it's something we've said a couple times here already. And then move your way down the stack. This is interesting because, and I think you just mentioned it a minute ago, Al, the deploy process becomes very easy. And we said that before. First, we made the build process easy, then the deploy process easy. But nothing's really ever free, right? Because now what you have is an orchestration challenge. So we've moved that boundary of challenge, or the sort of the optimization of it, out to the orchestration layer. And by starting smartly with this, the loosely coupled architecture, using dark features or feature flags, that sort of thing, planning well in the beginning, especially across the organization, because now you think about it, right? That probably represents 5 different teams on this page right now. So team of 10, that's 50 people you're looking at on this page. That has to be coordinated well. So you're not just coordinating technology, you're coordinating collaboration between groups. But it all goes back to the same thing. Start in a place you can control, make it work, learn your lessons, and then keep applying it.
So Chris, did we kill off the base continuous delivery pipeline? Or is this the starting small, optimized?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, right? Yeah. So this doesn't go anywhere. The base CD is still, if you think about it, what you've done to pipelines is what we're doing to applications. You're taking an application and you componentized it or you containerized it. Pipelines are the same thing. Now you have these basic pipelines that you're building up, and you're layering them and managing the pipelines almost as a fleet of delivery processes. So no, it doesn't go away. In fact, it's probably more important now to get it right at this level, because if you don't, it amplifies through, maybe dozens of pipelines or more.
Right.
So it boils down to having a standards, consistency, and scale.
Right. So you're saying that the promise is still real. We still got two pizza teams that are moving towards microservice architectures, leveraging APIs, taking on 12 factor principles to, peel off chunks of that monolithic application. And we have teams that are, using a tool of choice for that build pipeline, delivery pipeline. But the changes are still bigger than what a single squad owns.
Yeah, I think they always are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it grows too, right? Again, we're going back to consumers are wanting more, so they're going to want bigger things faster, and that it kind of amplifies that as well.
Right.
There's something interesting going on here too, Al. I think we're starting. So you're talking about now you have teams and squads on this page. I don't see the word tool anywhere. I think if you do this right and you do the architecture designs up front, feature flags and containerization, you can start to kind of relax restrictions around tools in general and let teams do what they want to do, as long as they're coordinating at the sort of the delivery, collaboration, and orchestration levels, and at the architectural levels where you can turn flags on and off. They should be able to deliver any way they want to, as long as they're basically coordinating the output at the end of all the pipes.
Yeah, and it is about people, the two pizza teams. It is about process and process optimization and collaboration, because, again, the changes are bigger than what a single squad would own or a tribe would own. It'd be across the enterprise. And, what we're saying is that's okay. There is 3 different paths that organizations can take as they move towards modern architectures and leveraging cloud. And just know that there's tools available to help. But the most important part to me is going back to what we had in an earlier slide, and none of this works without feedback. Continuously gaining insight on, is this working? Could we do better? We talked about the DevOps transformation being a journey, being a marathon. Yes, we're trying to disrupt our competition by getting new ideas into the market faster than they can, but we're also doing it to make sure that, we're delivering on what the customer needs. And then through our build pipeline, we're getting feedback. Are there tweaks that we could make? Is there new information? Is one team doing something differently that we can permeate throughout the organization and see those efficiencies appear on the other squads? So the feedback is critical, from not only making sure that we've delivered on the business results, met the expectations of the customer, but also continuously learn about opportunity for improvement within our process.
Yeah, so this kind of process, it lets you basically also deliver a series of wins. They don't always have to be big wins, but they have to be consistent, regular, and they can be a little bit smaller, but every week your customer should be able to say, yeah, this is a little bit better than last week. So the type of feedback, everything you said, it's all about learning, but it keeps you focused, it keeps you safer on your releases. You can adapt easier. You have the visibility into what you're doing. But I think one of the biggest things, on the delivery process, and we haven't really said it yet, but one of the goals, at least I have, is we want to remove the variance. We want predictability in the pipeline. And by applying this type of a process to it, you remove your variables and your variance. So you have an expectation of what's going through the pipeline. There are always going to be exceptions, so let's not pretend that failures don't happen in prod. Things are always going to fail, which is why you hear people talk about mean time to recover versus 0 failures. So handle the exceptions.
Right, and one of the other things that this continuous learning through feedback, it helps us identify our small wins. So when we're working with an organization and we're trying to keep our business stakeholders on board with, we're going down the right path, boss. We believe this to be the best way to approach, getting your business objectives into the hands of the customer. We are able to take some of this data and take it back to our management and say, we've been able to move the yardstick a foot this week, or we've moved it a mile this month, or something like that. But it's even giving feedback to your business stakeholders so that they stay on board with what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because, in my experience at least, although nobody wants to deliver bad news necessarily, news on a regular basis and they know where they stand on things, that's so much better than going 3 or 4 months and they get surprised. So I like the idea of having the regular feedback, and I've found that it's helped me in the things that we've done. Every Friday we have a executive communication, for example. We're like, here's the good, the bad, and the ugly of last week. But they always know where they stand at the end of every week, and that we found that very valuable.
So we didn't talk a lot about tools. There's many different options out there, but I wanted to take a minute or two to share what IBM Urbancode has. It's working with DevOps.com. We're trying to help organizations, and through helping organizations in this transformation, we're also trying to evangelize our product. So within the Urbancode suite, there's an integrated tool chain. Before we talked about Antil Pro that gave you the build and the deploy and the release capabilities in the horizontal presentation. But within Urbancode, we have Urbancode Build for the continuous integration component with integrations into many version control systems. So we can help manage the complex builds using build templates so that we're doing things the same way, better visibility into Urbancode Deploy, or a tighter integration with Urbancode Deploy, which is our build automation solution. The thing that takes the bits from the build artifacts from a repository and puts them into a variety of different target nodes, whether that be microservices, whether that be jar files, whether that be mainframe updates, cover a wide breadth of technologies. And then Urbancode Release is the capability that allows us to manage those various versions of the applications that need to go together across the different test stages en route to production. So while Antil Pro was a all-inclusive, within the Urbancode family, there's build, deploy, and release. And why is that? Well, the customers asked us for flexibility. And this tool separation delivers the flexibility that people are looking for. So maybe for a CI solution, an organization has a Git Jenkins CI system. With Urbancode Deploy, we can leverage the output from the Jenkins build process and push it through into the various target nodes so that we're automatically deploying, and we've got integration into a number of testing tools where, as part of that deployment process, we can deploy and then manage the releases across the many stages. Maybe you're using legacy rational clear case. Again, we've got integrations in place. Maybe you're using a Git version control system, Jenkins for build automation, Jenkins delivery pipeline, and you need to manage the releases of those many Jenkins delivery pipelines under one common value stream management tooling. And Urbancode Release has those integrations. And I know, Chris, you've used the Urbancode products out on a number of different client opportunities. What's your take?
Yeah, so this is I think this is a very important point here. So when you're in the business of providing, it's not really DevOps, your platform services to enable DevOps, right? But when you're doing that, when you're enabling that platform, your business isn't about necessarily creating tool chains and maintaining scripts. It's about creating the delivery system for value. And a lot of folks, we all get caught up because we like to write scripts, we like to play with technology, and we get caught up in it and we forget that the reason we're there is to help the development teams and the operations teams help that value chain flow. And so the good part about products like this is it helps us do that, right? I don't want to be writing scripts if I don't have to. And so, for example, with Urbancode Deploy, I think over 200 plugins are available for different tools, whatever you want to do. And it's very, very easy to use, where you would be able to just download a zip file, drop it in a directory, and it appears in the UI, and you can start using it. So, you might have to do a little bit of configuration once it's in there, but I like that idea where I can let vendors help me compose the tool chain value stream I want so that we can start moving code faster rather than trying to figure out how to basically write a system in many, many months. Another example on the build product side, so IBM Urbancode Build. In a large enterprise, you have teams using all different kinds of things, Perforce, Subversion, Git. And at the end of the day, it didn't matter to us as the platform provider. We just said, that's okay, I have a plugin for that. And we would integrate, however those teams wanted to operate, TFS, it didn't matter. Let them behave the way they want to as development teams so they maximize their creativity and code output. and we would take that and ingest it into the build process. And sort of the same thing with deploy as well for different testing integrations and different things like that. So when you're in a position where you have to manage this as a DevOps service providing team, the ability to have good tool integrations, multiple integrations, if you wanted to use Jenkins from a team or whatever, it's really critical for you to keep your costs down as a service provider, but also to provide like the uptime and the reliability needed to keep the code moving. And keeping the code moving is really satisfying the business value. And that's what you have to keep in mind, right? We're there to help the business ingest the code that the developers are writing.
Thanks, Chris. I couldn't have said that any better. You know, one last shameless plug. If you don't know, next week we've got a big show going on in Vegas called IBM Think. You know, Chris will be speaking. I'm speaking. Eric Minnick is speaking. We've got a track dedicated to DevOps and DevOps transformation. We've got experts on the floor to help with the entire the entire DevOps domain, right from the business side of things right through to the operations piece, and from basically cradle to grave and beyond. So if you got a chance, you're in Vegas or you haven't been to Vegas for a while and you want to come check it out, it's happening at the Mandalay Bay. The IBM.com/Think2018 is how you can register. We're looking for a really big show, a lot of client experiences, how they're using the tools, what are their lessons learned, what best practices are working for them. We've engaged a lot of our customers to come out and share, not only how they're getting value, but how they've solved the what. So I've been talking about, what is the problem? How did I solve it? And I really asked them to focus on the how and what was the wow. What did they get out of it? What was the value that they received from automating a particular practice area within that delivery pipeline? And with that, Alan, I'd like to open it up for questions if we could.
Absolutely can, guys, and we've got quite a few very pointed technical stuff here, guys. But let me start with the first question, which came from Richard Winslow, and that is, can you guys give us a few examples of how visualizing the flow helps an organization?
So for me, let me start on that, Chris. And
yeah,
then you can, so, visualizing, it's all about sharing information and giving access to what's going to happen so that everybody's on the same page. Sharing it through a web interface or making it available on a mobile device keeps people in the loop. And I think the better access people have to information, they can see the dependencies that they may have on other systems, and they can see the status on those dependencies as to whether they're ready or not. So, from visualizing the pipeline and showing the whatever option you take, whether it be option 2, where you've got multiple complex delivery pipelines feeding into a release management capability, or more simpler deployment pipelines feeding into an overall QA gate and then release into production pipeline, I don't see anything wrong in giving people information so that they stay informed.
Okay.
So I'd like to take because this is an interesting question. I think the way we construct our tool chains are kind of a version of Conway's Law, where they represent the organization and processes above them. And so one of the first things I like to do is do a value stream map. And it might be a little bit different than the Lean Agile world, but we're basically saying, all right, here's where you start with the code. As this code travels, here are the teams it goes through to get to where it's going. And it's very eye-opening. I did one of these exercises, and it took me a couple of weeks by the time I roped all the folks in. And at every time I took that to another group, they're like, that's not how it works. This is how it works. And that was actually the really surprising thing, is how many disagreements there were where people said, I didn't know it went there. And so once you map out the current state, you get to see a few things. You discover things about the process nobody knew. You start to see where there might be constraints in the flow, and you start to see, why does it even go there at all? If I have a tool to automate, why am I going to 3 different manual approval processes? You might find out that it's spending a lot of time in the QA environment, and that might force you to dig into, well, what's going on in that environment? Are they not standing up? Do we have the wrong code? So I think that one of the best places to start before you even start to wire your tools together, make sure you have a good current state of the value stream flow and where the constraints are.
Good. Okay. Next, we have a question from Greg. So Greg wants to know, is it a disadvantage that it's only called DevOps versus some of the other names? I have my feelings on it, but it's your webinar, guys. I'll let you answer first.
Oh boy, you've hit on a pet peeve of mine with calling it DevOps. You know, I started out many different roles and talked to many different customers out there, and I've heard the variations, you know, DevOps, NoOps, Dev Test Ops, Biz DevOps, Biz Dev Test Ops. It's endless. And I don't like the big D or the big O. That's a personal thing because I think it represents silos. So
I'm with you, Al.
It's a personal belief thing. You know, we needed to call it something. Let's put it at that. But let's not try to wrap it with a definition as to who it means. DevOps is always evolving. You know, these squads that we bring together span from the business, the development team, the test team, the DBA, the release engineer, the operations staff, the auditors, marketing, sales. They all have a voice in this DevOps world. And, you know, what we're trying to do is, you know, in this modeling and managing these releases, try to make sure that everybody is going to see success at the end of the day. Improve quality, tighten up feedback loops, get everybody's opinion. So I don't like pigeonholing DevOps to be just development and operations. I believe it's so much bigger than that. And I know, Chris, you've got opinions on this too. We've had this discussion many times.
Yeah, no, it pretty much echoes yours. You know, we don't have a better term, but at the end of the day, it does create. First of all, it excludes other groups that are in there, and I'm glad you mentioned risk audit and marketing because nobody ever thinks about that, or even finance. Go try to fund a project in an agile way, and some kind of conversation you have with a traditional PM role. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a linguistic silo too, right? It's dev and it's ops. The same thing we're trying to break down. We're now putting two words together to emphasize that there's two different things. So, but just keep in mind that DevOps represents, a concept, a philosophy of collaboration and working together. And, if we can just agree that DevOps isn't the right word, but it's the only word we have.
So let me just quickly weigh in. In my view, DevOps has really outgrown its initial focus on dev and ops and breaking those two silos down to become more of an umbrella term that talks about multidiscipline teams, multifunctional teams working together. And it even exceeds just pure IT. You could have HR and sales and biz ops in there as well. So I'll take the last word on that one. We have time for one more question. Here's from Kumar. For organizations looking to start DevOps practices, what should be key considerations and how should it be taken up to be successful? We can spend an hour or two on that alone.
Yeah.
But
Chris, that's your sweet spot, my friend. Why don't you lead us off on that one?
Man, okay. Yeah, it could take a long time, but not knowing anything about your organization, and every organization is going to be different. You all have a different culture. So some baseline tips would be find some advocates, right? And find a place, like if you're in a platform services group, find some developers that want to work with you really well. And they're like, hey, yeah, we don't care. Let's break stuff and have fun. And by the way, get your ops people and just like we said, break down those barriers, get the team together, right? Bring the band back together. So start in a place where you can control a lot of the outcomes and you have some folks that are supporting you and then build those alliances. The next thing you really want to do is part of it, right? Try to get some top cover executive support, but you might be either getting grassroots or executive. You can get both. That's better. The next thing is you've got to get some points on the board. So again, it goes back to what we said earlier. You don't have to have these big wins, and it definitely can't take 9 months. But you need little wins that show you moving in the right direction that people can start to bet on. And by doing that, you'll start to attract followers and supporters, and then you kind of just move up the curve. And once you're at about 20% supporters, you've kind of won. You don't need 50%. After 20%, people are jumping on board. So start small in places you can control. Bring your friends together across the spectrum. and just start putting small points on the board regularly.
Excellent. Guys, just one quick one. Someone asked, can you explain the difference between DevOps and Agile? And I'm going to take that. You know, a lot of people say DevOps takes up where Agile leaves off, but Agile is primarily about the development process and software developers and using an Agile process. At the DevOps Institute, of which I'm a co-founder, we actually do have an Agile for Ops class, and you can extend that. But when you look at DevOps, it takes things from Agile, it takes things from Lean, as well as other places. And so I'm going to make that as I got the last word in on this one, Al and Chris, I got you there. But we're going to have to call it a day. We're at the top of the hour. Guys, really, I got to tell you, we do, you know how many, 3-4 webinars a week. This was one of the best ones we've done yet. Fantastic, fantastic job, gentlemen. Hope to have you back on again soon. To everyone who came, thank you for joining us. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and we hope to see you soon on another DevOps.com webinar. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.